Yeah,
Thank you for
thank
helping us
you.
kick off Pride Month with our event.
My pleasure.
So I have one in the chat from M. How easy or difficult was it to adapt the fan book into book format? And what was the most challenging part?
It seems like it should be really easy, um, but it never is quite as straightforward as you think it's going to be. I think for Two in a Pattern, it was easier than Honey in the Marrow because the story was already farther removed away from like the TV canon, right? It was a earlier time period. It was like a time when we had not yet met those characters. So adapting this one was great because it was kind of its own story. Um, but you do have to sort of think about, okay, well, what are the things that people are used to in fanfic that is maybe a little bit too lazy for like a published book. You know, there's a lot of shorthand in fan fiction because everybody knows everything about the characters already. So you really have to think about backstory. You have to think about those shortcuts that you take that maybe aren't going to work, and then figure out how to fill in those gaps.
Mhm. And can I ask what drew you to the both of your books, published books have, and actually your fanfic, right? All has law enforcement and that, and
Mm-hmm.
what drew you to that topic?
Well, it was based on, they were both based on the same show, The Closer, which was that 2005 Kira Sedgwick show where she's the like murder detective. And so
Mm-hmm.
set in that universe, it's easy to sort of keep that framework. I work in, I'm a librarian. I work in government, but I've worked in local government, you know, like city government. I've worked for the county government. I've worked for the federal government. So when you have these government jobs, you sort of see that kind of bureaucracy up close a lot. And so writing within that framework is something a little bit familiar to me as you're navigating like that sort of structure.
Okay. I'm curious. So you said these are both based on the same fan fiction, um, but they're pretty wildly different stories. The setting's pretty different, you know, the age of the characters, the struggles they're going through. Um, so what made you want to write two like starkly different stories?
Yeah, they were based on the same show, not the same story. I think that's an important point. Um, I think, you know, I've been writing for a really long time, especially fan fiction. I've been writing since I was like a young teenager. And I think at this point, I'd written so much that I was really ready to sort of like branch out and write new kinds of stories. Honey in the Marrow is a very sort of straightforward romance. And having done that, I mean, that's my favorite sort of thing to read is, you know, you find a story you love and you just want to read it over and over again, like the same but different. And so I've read a lot of those like sort of romances where I'm like, I love this, it's the same but it's different. um, but because I had been writing those kinds of stories for a really long time, I thought Two is a Pattern would be like a great sophomore book because it was so different. It was different when I wrote it for me. It was different, sort of the journey from fan fiction to published. And it was really fun to write something that was a little bit out of my comfort zone and, you know, had more plot than just the feelings. I write a lot about, you know, the feelings, the vibes. In Honey in the Marrow, Stella just sort of like bums around her house a lot, and that's like kind of the plot is her getting back onto her feet. Whereas in Two as a Pattern, the main storyline isn't the love story, right? It's Annie trying to escape this situation that she can't seem to find her way out of. So like the love story in that book for me is Annie and her freedom. Can she find it? Can she get it? Can she keep it? And then Helen is like the B plot where they fall in love. So it was just a exciting venture for me, I think.
Do
That makes
you
sense.
have, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Do you have a favorite then of the books your two books?
You can't You can't ask someone if they have a favorite child. That's no.
I
um,
mean, I can ask, but
you
you
can't
surely don't have to have an answer.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to say. I really love Honey in the Marrow. It's maybe the most sort of vulnerable story I had ever written. Um, but at the same time, I think Two as a Pattern is really, really fun. And I think there's like a lot of story left in that universe. So like while I really love Honey in the Marrow, it's like a complete thing, right? Like I wrote it, I published it, it came out, it like lives alone, it belongs to other people now. Whereas is a pattern, I'd like to keep writing that story, so it feels sort of unfinished still.
I have a question from Kaz. How was it different to write? The two, I'm assuming. Is that
Oh,
what you're asking? Yeah.
it was a lot more, I think, research based. You had to really, it takes place in the end of 1992, the beginning of 1993, right? So there was a lot going on at that time, especially in Los Angeles. There had been like the Rodney King riots had just happened. It was a presidential election year, so Clinton wins the campaign, and that sort of like changes the direction of the country. The Cold War had just ended, right? So there's all of these things converging on Annie's life, and I wanted to make sure those things were accurate, and then the more fun things like the fashion and the music and the cars and the sort of technology that she would have at her disposal took a lot of sort of research. But I really like doing research. I mean, obviously, I became a librarian, so I sort of answer questions for a living. But that
Mhm.
that was really different for me because it wasn't just like, how is this character feeling? What are the vibes? Um, so it was
Mhm.
more structured for sure.
What kind of research did you have to do into the intricacies of the life of a CIA agent? What was that research like?
Um, it was interesting. I read a lot of books about CIA agents that they had published after leaving the agency about their time like working in that field. I also wrote a lot of, or read a lot of mystery novels that were set in that 1992 time period. That was a really interesting experiment because a lot of mystery writers at that time were male, and I don't read a lot of male authors anymore. So it was fascinating, and it really sort of led to the way that Annie's supervisor treats her in that book, because so many of those early 90s mysteries like didn't have female characters, or they like it was somebody's wife or somebody's mother or often a prostitute,
Mhm.
and they often like didn't have names and were just treated like absolute
Mhm.
garbage. And I was like, oh, this is probably why I don't like to read this genre from this time. But I've
Mhm.
gotten a lot of feedback of like, I hate Annie's boss, I hate the like sexist way that she's treated, and I'm here to say like she did not enjoy that either. But that was sort of a reality of that time period.
Yeah.
And and on that note, what made you decide to set Two as a Pattern in the early 90s? That's from
Yeah,
M.
I think I had wanted, when it was a fan fiction, I had wanted to write like, what if these two characters met a lot earlier, and if they had met at this ages, like what year would it be? And that was sort of the math
Mhm.
that led me to that early 90s. It was sort of right at the beginning. I mean, we're in it deep now, but the beginning of the 90s sort of coming back into vogue, like fashion wise. So it just seemed like a really good time to capitalize on that sweet, cool
Mhm.
90s trend.
As far as like your writing style, it sounds like you're doing a lot of research. Would you consider yourself a plotter, or what's your kind of writing style in that regard?
It seems like I would be. However, I'm not usually. I will do a lot of like world building research, I think. But as for like the actual plot, I usually have like one or two scenes in my head that I'm writing toward. that I find the most interesting, or sort of like a vague notion of what I want like the tropes of the story to be. Um, and for like two is a pattern, the trope was really like, well, they want to, but they shouldn't, right? So that's sort of what I wrote around. But I just don't plot out every chapter because
Mhm.
even when I have tried that, I usually like will write away from the outline. So I'm like, well, what's the point at that point? I'm just gonna write what I want to write and we'll make it work.
I've got a couple questions in the chat.
Sure.
Um, so some of us felt like the end was kind of abrupt. It just
Yeah.
felt like that we kind of suddenly shifted and then ended. And that kind of rolls into like the secondary question is you kind of mentioned that there's room for an additional story here. And we had all also kind of noticed that as well. So we're curious if you're already working on a sequel and if that'll start at the 12 years later, or if you've chosen a different time period, or what you can tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, I knew that was gonna be like a wild thing to do. But at the same time, I was really interested in um, writing a story that was true to Annie. And because she was so desperate to get her freedom, like that's what I wanted to show. Like she get it. But it was a long time ago. It was a difficult time for her to navigate. And the reality of the situation was like she wasn't going to get that freedom quickly or easily, right? So it took her a long time to get out of the situation that she was in. Um, and her main goal was to find her way back to Helen. So that's sort of how that came about. Um, and some people really liked it, which I found really interesting. I thought most people were gonna like flip a table and walk away, and
Mm.
I was okay with that. But a lot of people were like, "Wow, that was really realistic," and I appreciate that. So that was an interesting dynamic to see.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've definitely started writing the second part. Um, and maybe like I want to say like a third of the way through it.
Okay.
And it picks up where this one ends, right? So like Annie's back, but the second book would be from Helen's point of view and how they navigate this like new phase of their relationship moving forward. Which
That's
I see some
awesome.
smiles because I think that's what we all want, me included. So
I think you made everybody happy with that one. But can I ask you quickly? Kaz
yeah,
is working her magic for the video portion. Can you try putting your camera on again
you
for a
know,
moment? And she also said you made her feel ancient because of the 90s, and it seems like yesterday for her.
it's telling me I can't start my video because the host is
Oh,
the one who stopped it.
yeah.
So
The
I
host stopped it?
yeah.
Who
Yeah.
stopped it? There we go.
I did try to
Thank
put it
you.
back on, but then I was like, well, maybe they don't want it on. So
Thank you.
I
yeah. And
gotcha.
then what was the second part of that question? You said turn on your video and then
Amy.
something else.
Oh,
Oh,
Kaz, I was saying that
feels
Kaz
old.
said the 90s was a walk down memory lane.
Oh
Calling it
yeah.
historic makes me feel ancient.
Yeah. I do remember the 90s. I was not an adult in 1992, but I was old enough to remember it. But I think that was sort of funny is like at what point do you begin to say something is like a historical fiction, I think 30 years is like a we're starting to get to the point where maybe it's historical fiction, but it's not like a hill I gotta die on. So
I've heard people say that historical fiction starts 20 years ago. We're
well,
already in the 2000, 20 years ago. So I am like Stone Age then.
now
That's
I
all I
feel
got to
really
say.
old, so I guess that's what I deserve.
Um, so I actually have a question for you about Honey in the Marrow, if you're cool with
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
That one really, really took a deep dive into the experience of grief. And I'm curious what made you want to explore that so much.
Yeah, I was thinking about writing a story about somebody who was really competent, sort of on top of their field, in a very sort of like secure relationship. and then what would it take for something to topple that person, someone who is always good at everything, and has everything figured out. And so I thought grief was probably the thing that would do that. So if you take away everything that a person depends on, can they like get their life back in order? And I had started to write that book as sort of like an exercise. And then while I was writing it, my grandfather passed away, and I was like
Mhm.
kind of raised by my grandparents. So it became really like a way to process my own grief. And I think that's sort of why people are like, wow, you really wrote grief really realistically. And I was like, yeah, I was sad. Um, but with Stella, she had been very independent and very professional and very advanced in her career, and it all sort of goes away. And I think it was a really important message of you can get through it, but probably not alone. So you're going to have to let people help you. And that's a lesson that even and I don't really like to think about that much, but is the hard truth of grief is it's so difficult to get out of it alone.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Kaz is following up with that. Again, all of us, I think, so sorry for your loss.
Oh, thank
And yeah, and that you poured that into that book, gave it that extra to it. Kaz said, "I'm sorry for your loss, even though the book is probably so much more intimate." Yeah.
you. Yeah. I think personality wise, I'm probably more like Annie as a character. But I think emotionally, like Honey in the Marrow is a lot of what was in me at that time, if that makes sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I tend to be more competent professionally and like a mess personally. So that's very like Annie of me. But yeah, I think if you want to get to know me as a person, maybe more, Honey in the Marrow is the book to read for sure.
Okay, so the next question we have down here, Annie has developed a great skill in adapting to a situation to get out of it what she wants, but at the same time, she wants to live more authentically. What was that a difficult juxtaposition to write?
Yeah, I think when you're at that age, 27, you're sort of, you're in your late 20s, you're not really like a young kid figuring it out anymore, but you also sort of lack the skills of someone with a lot more experience, right? So she's navigating it in the best way that she knows how. She knows that this job is hurting her emotionally, and even though she's good at it, like it's not worth it for her to stay in a position where she's gonna like endanger people's lives, right? So she does what she thinks is the best thing, and just cold turkey is like, I'm out. Um, which is not always easy to do. Um, but at the same time, she doesn't really know what it means to be her own person yet. And she really struggles with that. And she thinks she really is only as good as like what she can bring to whatever situation she's in, whether it's like languages or law enforcement or helping people or whatever. And so she really has to learn that hard lesson of I'm worthy even if I'm not like giving a skill. Someone wrote in a review that she was autistic coded, and I was like, oh, this is a weird way to learn something about yourself. But I think that makes a lot of sense because she's so focused, she's so single-minded. Her like special interest is languages. She gets really good at them. She can sort of turn off her emotions when she needs to. And she's really good at masking, right? She'll come into a situation, she'll sort of get the lay of the land and then like become the person that she needs to successfully navigate that situation. And because she's been doing that her whole life, figuring out who she is without all of that is really difficult for her. But Helen has the ability to sort of look at her and see the real Annie, and I think that's why they connect so well. Is Helen just
Mhm.
likes what she sees regardless of what's happening, and Annie has never really encountered that before.
Hmm. That's such an
I'm
interesting
aware of the
answer.
time, aware, but yeah. I'm listening to you saying the code. I'm like, wait, doesn't everybody do that? They kind of
I
like,
know, right?
I
Uh-oh.
know I do. So,
I read that
uh-oh,
literally and went, uh-oh, out loud.
what? Um, Kaz is asking, who are your favorite authors, Sapphic or otherwise? And on follow up with that is your favorite types of books that you read for pleasure. And I am aware of the time, so if it's
Yeah,
okay. That question.
my favorite book of all time is Harriet the Spy, which sounds like a joke now that I've said that, but it really is. Because, as a child, I really sort of related to a girl who was introverted and just wanted to know everything versus like make friends in that way. Um, I love Rosalind Sinclair, obviously. I love
Mhm.
Melina Mackay for Sapphic fiction. And my favorite like general author just growing up was Alice Hoffman, who wrote Practical Magic. She had a really cool knack of sort of weaving everyday magic into like regular life, which I found really fascinating. So,
Very cool.
yeah.
Um, I'm curious if you said you've been writing like fan fiction, you've been writing since you were young.
Yeah.
If if publishing books is something you always saw yourself doing, or if you were surprised when you made that move into publishing and how that's been.
Um, yeah, it's something I sort of thought about in the back of my mind, especially like the longer I was doing it. Where I was like, well, if it's like a bucket list thing where I was like, well, maybe one day I'd like to publish a novel. But I know that's a lot of work. And I didn't know that I would get to a point where like looking for an agent and querying and doing all of that while working full time was going to be feasible. So I just sort of was like, well, if it happens, it happens. And it wasn't like a thing I was working towards necessarily. And then Lee Winter reached out and was like, hey, we love your story where we were talking about publishing it with Ilva. Would you be interested? And I was like, well, it was gonna fall into my lap, I might as well. So I talked to Astrid, who's the CEO of Ilva, and we sort of hammered out the details and I was like, yeah, let's do it. My concern was if I turn something I love that's like kind of my only hobby into a job, am I still gonna love it? And so that's been a really interesting thing to navigate because now I'm sort of like, well, if I'm writing, I should be working on something that's going to be published. And then do I just like give up fan fiction forever? I don't know. So that's something I'm still working on. I think I probably won't give up fan fiction forever. Um, but I have been writing less of it because it's a lot of work to publish books. So
Yeah.
we'll see how it goes.
Well, we appreciate that you're willing to put that work and that time in. So,
Yeah, I love it.
Absolutely. And I
Thank
can
you.
imagine finding that balance of not losing the joy and the fun in the writing
Yeah,
between, publishing books, right?
yeah.
mhm.
The writing is never the issue. I always love the writing. The editing is not the fun part, I would say. It's always difficult to have someone come in and be like, why would you say that? And I have to be like, I don't know. And I really learned a lot about commas during the process and and how to use them more accurately.
Comma dilemma.
I use commas with my heart and not
Yeah,
logic, so yeah, that's
me
relatable.
and the M dash, I'm like, you could try to rip it out of my hands, but I'm not going. So yeah.
We've got
It's
Awesome.
still joyous to me. I don't think I'm in a situation. I'm in awe of the people who can like publish a book a year or two books a year. That's not really the situation that I'm in. But I'd rather, spend a little extra time to produce something that I'm happy with the time that I have than like rush through it. So I think people
Mhm.
understand that.
Absolutely. And just one quick winding up type question. Well,
Sure.
actually, it's two. What is your fan fiction name, and would you ever consider writing fantasy?
Yeah. My AO3 name, it's Miss Parker. It's pretty much Miss Parker everywhere. And I've never changed it, which people think are crazy. You know, like people change their handle all the time, and I'm like, no. And people have even messaged me and been like, "Can I have it?" And I'm like, "No, it's me." Um, and I'm not. When it comes to fantasy, I'd probably be more likely to do sci-fi over fantasy. I'm not a big
Mhm,
fantasy reader, um,
mhm,
or watcher really.
Mm.
But I am a Star Trek person, so I could see that sort of thing in my future, but I don't know that much about fantasy. I'm sorry.
There you go, Kaz. That was Kaz's question.
I know. It's not the first time I've been asked it. I'm like, I'm not gonna do it justice. So there are so many really amazing fantasy writers out there, and Godspeed. You know,
Oh, Kaz had one more. Okay, and then we're going to end, Kaz, because we're over
sure,
time.
sure, sure.
More about the magic, like practical magic? Question mark.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah. I think women's lives are really interesting, which obviously. But I am always interested in sort of really professionally competent women. Like, what are they like at home? You know, like what is their domestic life like? Um,
Mhm.
and then the things that make women really special, I think, sort of easily can segue into that like magical realism that Alice Hoffman provides. You know, they're just women living their lives, but maybe they have like a special skill, or maybe they're really good at healing, or maybe their grandmother taught them, like XYZ. And I think that sort of level of everyday magic is probably about as fantastical as I could get with a plot. I have been
Mhm.
working on, I'm like, not only am I not a plotter, but I'm like, I gotta write like four things at once. Cause if I get stuck somewhere, then I can just sort of like cycle through and work on things a little bit at a time. And one of the things that I've been working at is that sort of like a woman who knows that she has this skill, but like is afraid to use it. And then like someone coming in and being like, I need you to help me with this. And that's sort of the big plot of my like very soft magical realism book that I'm kind of
Okay.
thinking about.
Kind of.
Thumbs up. Great. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us once again, and been enjoyed listening to you and getting all these burning questions answered.
Yeah. Thank you
And
for the question.
we, yeah, we're really looking forward to book two and the finding out what's up with Helen and Annie.
I'm chipping away at it. Don't worry.
Thank you so much for
Well,
joining us today. And
yeah,
thanks everybody for being here.
yeah, thank you. Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy
Right.
Pride.